Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. So today, in relation to the video you're hopefully about to watch, we're going to add a new post to the articles section. As you can see, I'm poorly typing that this is going to be titled Great Ships of Henry VIII, an English translation of the Anthony Roll, or a modern translation, because it obviously is in Tudor English as well. And then I can simply type a little bit of text to allow you to download the spreadsheet in question, and then just go link, and then obviously you start with URL, but I want file, so upload the spreadsheet in question. Job done. There, the link is already established, and then I can just go save, publish, and of course the article also needs a little header, so I can go and change that, upload a picture from the Anthony Roll. All done. And this way, you can very easily access the spreadsheet with all the relevant data in it. But if I want to add some text to the article later, I just click on the plus, put text, and then I can just put future text as a placeholder, and it's all there ready and set up. So I can have the link in a separate block to the text. I can move that around as I wish, and then go into articles, and there it is. Nice and easy way of sharing information with Squarespace. So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing, you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drakenfell. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show. So a little while ago, I had a thought. Let's talk about the Tudor Navy of Henry VIII. So I started looking up facts and figures for the fleet of Henry VIII, only to discover that the only reliable source on it all that covers the whole fleet, the Anthony Roll, while it has been transliterated many times, has not, at least as far as I was able to discover, been translated in full. And what I mean by that is that people have turned the facts and figures in fancy spidery Tudor handwriting into standard typeface block letters. However, it's all still in what you might call Tudor spelling, Tudor numerals, etc., which can make it very difficult to understand. Now, certain ships, like the Mary Rose, understandably have then been translated into proper English, but it became very clear to me very quickly that if I wanted to talk about the whole fleet, I was going to have to basically translate the Anthony Roll myself. And this faced three major challenges: language, numbers, and definitions. So let me talk about those for a little bit first. Language, some of it was fairly obvious. So tonnage, but spelt Tunage, mariners spelt Marrynars, gunners spelt Gonnars. That's all fairly obvious what it is. Other stuff was also relatively obvious just from the context. So, for example, the guns of brass, or guns of brass, as listed. Cannon was actually spelt in the modern way, or I guess we spell it in the ancient way. Culverins, very similar spelling, but then you get to things like Canon Perez. What the heck is a Canon Perez? Turns out that's actually Canon Petro in Spanish. And to be fair, Perez was fairly obvious if you understand the Latin root of the general term anyway. And essentially it's a cannon, but one that's designed purely to throw stone balls instead of iron ones. And so it goes on. And the language kind of goes into the definition as well, because then you have some things like further down, things such as sledges of iron. Now, sledges of iron is actually relatively easy to translate over into modern English because it's spelt very similarly and sounds exactly the same. But what on earth is a sledge of iron, and why is it in the munitions section? Well, it turns out, after a bit of digging, that it actually means sledgehammer, which perhaps explain why they're listed next to crows of iron, i.e. iron crowbars. And then you have the slightly more esoteric terms like commanders, which don't have any specific translation into modern English, but essentially are just really big wooden mallets. So there was that translation and definition work going on, but also Tudor numbers. They used their own special system of modified Roman numerals, at least in the Anthony Roll. So you're probably aware of Roman numerals, I, V, X, L, C, etc. But they use them in a slightly different way. So in the Tudor numbers, you don't use IV for 4, you use III, because apparently the last I, or the last 1, in Tudor Roman is always a J. So if it's on its own, it's a J. 2 is IJ, 3 is IIJ, and so on and so forth. The use of 100, or C, is a little bit lax, because sometimes you might find it presented as C, or 300 be CCC, but other times you might find it represented as IIJ superscript C. And the same thing with thousands, which might be represented by M, but is more commonly represented by a superscript ML, accompanied by a number showing how many thousand. 80 is not written as LXXX, as you might anticipate. It's in fact written as XX over IIIJ, like it was some kind of division, which in Tudor actually means 20 multiplied by 4, i.e. 80. And finally, there's the liberal use of other measures mixed in amongst the numbers. So most things are rated in just the number of things that they have, but then gunpowder that's measured in barrels or demi-barrels, i.e. half barrels, is measured in lasts. So if you see serpentine powder in barrels, serpentine powder being a finer, older style of gunpowder, corn powder being a more powerful, slightly more up-to-date version, serpentine powder sometimes used as a primer at this stage. Well, that serpentine powder might be listed as 2, but it's 2 lasts, which is a Tudor measure that is just over a ton. Bowstrings are measured in gross, i.e. 144, so X gross is actually 10 times 144, i.e. 1,440. Canvas is measured in ells, another obsolete unit of length. Paper rolls for cartridges are measured in quarters. Ropes for hemp are measured in coils. Lime pots are measured in dozens. Wheels for cannon are measured in pairs. And timber is measured in feet. So, fun. And then finally we have the guns themselves, and these are divided into bronze guns, or guns of brass as they're called at the time, and iron guns, which signifies what the weapons themselves are made of, and then further subdivided by type. And interestingly, in some of the smaller ones, they're also further subdivided by both the length of the barrel and the kind of shot that they fire. So if you've seen the development of cannon video a while back, you'll already know most of them, but just for a quick reference as you see this going forward, a cannon fires a 60-pound shot, a demi-cannon a 33-pound shot, a culverin a 17.5-pound shot, a demi-culverin 9.5 pounds, sakers 5.5 pounds, cannon petros 33.5 pounds but stone, falcons a 3-pound shot, minions a 4-pound shot, and that's most of the bronze guns. Then the iron guns, you have port pieces, which are bronze guns, 8 calibers long, firing stone shot, slings, which are iron guns, 12 calibers long, firing iron shot, demi-slings and quarter slings, which are obviously diminutives of the sling, the fowler, which is an 8 caliber bronze gun like the port piece, but also firing stone shot, rather unhelpfully, which means port pieces and fowlers are technically the same, but for some reason distinguished. Bases are iron 30 caliber length guns firing lead shot. Top pieces fire stone shot. Hail shot pieces fire lots of bits of iron shot. And then you have the complete handguns, which are, well, basically very, very small cannon on the end of a stick that you point in the vague direction of your enemy. Based on the number of rounds carried, it also appears that bases probably fired at least some form of cluster munition, maybe a kind of early grape shot. Other weapons you might not be quite so familiar with. Morris pikes are just regular pikes but somewhat shortened for use aboard ships. And darts for tops are, well, little iron throwing darts that you lob from a ship's crow's nest. You'll also see the longbows, the bowstrings, and the arrows measured in sheaves of 24 each. And the powder, as I said, can come in barrels, demi-barrels, in which case both are measured in lasts, or in pounds for the fine corn powder that used to actually set off the gun, and you find gunpowder measured in pounds in some of the smaller ships. So with that said, let's go through Anthony Roll 1, that is the great ships of Henry VIII's Tudor fleet, and establish exactly how each of them was equipped. So first off, we have the Henry Grâce à Dieu, aka the Great Harry. As you can see here, she's registered at 1,000 tons burthen, making her the largest ship in Henry VIII's fleet, with a total crew of 700, composed of very precisely 349 soldiers, 301 mariners, and 50 gunners, which shows that although, as you can see, she is liberally equipped with guns, this is still an era where small arms fire and boarding is expected to make up a good majority of a ship's combat capability. Now, as for firepower, in terms of bronze guns, so these are generally the larger ship killers, although there are a few iron ones, but most of the iron ones tend to be smaller. You can see we have 21 bronze guns in total, 4 big cannon, 3 demi-cannon, 4 culverin, 2 demi-culverin, 4 sakers, 2 stone throwers, and 2 little falcons. You'll notice in some of these tables, some items are listed as a 0 value. Here, for example, the Great Harry carries no minions, but that's just because some of the other ships do, and it was easier to format the tables consistently if I just listed everything that potentially could be carried on a Tudor warship of Henry VIII, and then just set the values for 0 for the ones where that particular ship didn't carry one of that particular item. But anyway, one thing you'll notice is that there is basically no conformity. They've essentially stuck on, well, it might look like whatever gun they like, but as we mentioned before, obviously these guns have different shot weights, so you might find the cannon in the bow and the stern. There's almost certainly 2 cannon poking out at the bottom of the stern there, because those are nice, big, heavy guns you can use either in the chase or as you wheel around to re-engage. And the others will have been chosen partly on the basis of shot weight, partly on the basis of where you can actually fit them on the ship. And where you have odd numbers, like the demi-cannon, that's almost certainly signifying that at least one of those guns is a centrally mounted bow chaser. And then we move on to guns of iron, and you'll notice there's 130 of these listed. I didn't include handguns because although they're listed under iron guns, the handguns are essentially small arms. And that technically, by Tudor methods, makes this ship a 151 gunner, although, as you'll see, most of them are fairly small. So you have port pieces, 14 of them, 4 slings, 2 demi-slings, 8 fowlers, and then 60 bases, 2 top pieces, and 40 hail shot pieces. Now, we did mention before that the bases are 30 caliber length iron guns that fire lead shot, but given the fact that they're listed just above the top pieces, which are small guns to go in the fighting tops, and the hail shot pieces, which are essentially gigantic shotguns, you can pretty easily make out that a base is not a particularly large weapon. So you're probably looking at port pieces being the upper broadside guns, and then the bases not really actually depicted here, but they would be mounted essentially swivel gun style, along with the hail shot pieces, except that the bases fire somewhat larger bits of ammunition. And you have 100 handguns, which by this period probably mean things like arquebuses and so forth. And yeah, there's a Saker and a demi-culverin there because, again, some of the smaller ships actually had these guns, which are most commonly found in bronze, but in iron, but we'll see that later. In terms of gunpowder, the ship carries just over 8 tons, because remember, the ones measured in barrels and demi-barrels are actually lasts, which are just over a ton. So you've got just over 2 tons of serpentine powder, so that would be your primer powder on the bigger guns, and also very fine powder for some of the smaller firearms, and then 6 tons of corn powder, which would be your general propellant. And here you can see the shot breakdown for the iron shot listed for the various guns. You can see there what they term dice for hail shot, so if you've ever been to the Mary Rose Museum, you'll see that hail shot at that point was literally iron cubes. There's also, interestingly, crossbar shot, i.e. a kind of dismantling or dismasting shot, 100 rounds of that carried. And in overall terms, it seems they were expecting to use around 20 to 25 rounds of shot in some of the heavier guns, cannon and demi-cannon for instance, but certain kinds, like the culverins and the sakers, were provided with slightly more, about 30 rounds per gun. as opposed to 20 to 25 for the really big cannon. But generally speaking, somewhere between 20 and 30 rounds per gun, at least for the anti-shipping weapons, seems to be pretty standard. And this carries through into the stone and lead shot provisions, and each of these tables is basically a separate section on the Antony roll. Although rather interestingly, both the bases and the handguns are provided with about 2,000 lead shot apiece, despite the fact there are 60 bases and 100 handguns. So that indicates that perhaps they were thinking they were going to get more use out of the bases rather than the handheld firearms. And then you have the issued hand weapons, which vastly exceed the number of soldiers aboard, so obviously the mariners would be using some of these as well. You've got 500 yew bows, so obviously quite a lot of spares there. You've got just under 1,500 bow strings, so approximately an issue ratio of 3 strings to the bow. You then got 750 sheaves of arrows, each sheaf being 24 arrows, so you're about 30 arrows per bow, although slightly higher than that per archer, because of course many of those bows are spares. You then have 200 short pikes, 200 bills, and 1,200 darts to lob if you happen to be up in the fighting tops. Then you've got the general equipment, so you've got a variety of hammers and crowbars for moving things around and hitting things. Tampions, so 5,000 of those for stuffing on top of your shot and powder. And you've also got paper rolls and canvas for cartridges, both these measured in quarter lengths, and formers for cartridges, so you can use those to turn the paper and canvas into new cartridges as well. And then finally you have spares and stores, 10 coils of hemp rope, around 1,000 nails, 12 leather bags, 6 firkins, which are powder storage leather bags, 240 lime pots, 4 pairs of spare wheels, 4 spare truckles, spare extras. It's not entirely clear what these refer to, but they could also refer to, given the context, additional parts of cannon carriages. So the wheels would be for the guns that are on 2 big wheels like their field guns, and the truckles would be, well, the little 4-wheel trucks. Then you've got 24 sheepskins for use in sponges for sponging out the guns when they're fired, and 100 feet of timber for wedges and coins, so adjusting the elevation of the guns and presumably also for some ship repair if it got damaged. Now, hopefully going through each ship won't take quite as long as this, because obviously I've put down a little bit of explanation for each of the tables here, but let's move on to perhaps the most famous Tudor vessel, the Mary Rose. Now, the Mary Rose is quite an interesting one, because as you can see, she's 700 tons burthen, so she's reasonably smaller than the Henry Grâce-à-Dieu, but although her crew is also proportionally smaller, she has a slightly higher balance of mariners and gunners as compared to soldiers, as compared to the Great Harry, and we'll see that as we go through her equipment as well. So she is a little bit more of a gunship than Henry Grâce-à-Dieu, which, as we saw, is very much configured not just for gunfire, but for extensive boarding actions as well. It's not to say that with 185 soldiers aboard, Mary Rose was a slouch at boarding, but you will see as we go onwards that some of Henry VIII's fleet seems to be more configured for gunnery than it is necessarily for straight-up boarding actions, but it varies on a ship-to-ship basis. We only have 15 bronze guns here, 2 of almost every kind except for a battery of 6 demi-culverin and a single falcon. And interestingly, no stone-thrower cannons, which seem to be relatively uncommon in Henry's fleet. And interestingly, although on a guns per ton ratio the Mary Rose is slightly more heavily armed with bronze guns compared to Henry Grâce-à-Dieu, obviously there are fewer of them, but for her size there's slightly more, there's proportionally fewer iron guns. The reduction in port pieces is actually very small. There's only 2 less than on Henry Grâce-à-Dieu, 12 instead of 14. Most of the other guns are present in relatively small numbers, similar to Henry Grâce-à-Dieu, but the number of bases halves, and so does the number of hail shot pieces, along with the number of handguns. So again, the anti-personnel weaponry of the Mary Rose is being dropped quite dramatically compared to Henry Grâce-à-Dieu, compared to her displacement, but the anti-shipping battery is proportionally slightly heavier. She's got just over 5 tons of powder, split 2 to 3 between serpentine and corn. Now, the section of dice for hail shot was unreadable and has been for a very, very long time, but one of the other interesting things is when you're looking at the iron shot proportions per number of guns aboard for the heavier guns is either the same or slightly higher than Henry Grace Adieu, particularly things like demi-cannon shot, for instance. Although in an inversion compared to Henry Grace Adieu, the amount of ammunition carried for bases is actually lower than the amount of ammunition carried for handguns on a per-gun basis, as well as in absolute terms. Then in terms of non-firearm hand weapons, you see again a rather interesting artifact in that what you might term the offensive weaponry, the bows, arrows, and darts, drops roughly in proportion to the drop in number of crew, although darts is actually a very low proportion. But pikes and bills only drop by about a quarter, whereas the crew numbers have dropped by almost 40%. So again, this is perhaps indicating that what hand-to-hand weaponry is equipped on Mary Rose is perhaps more designed for defensive work than offensive work, maybe. And this more gunship role is, again, perhaps reflected in the munitions, because you've got 80% the tampions and actually a lot of canvas for cartridges, but the paper rolls for the smaller handguns and so forth are quite diminished. And I would argue the spares and stores finally probably puts a seal on the idea that the Mary Rose is perhaps more of a gunship than her larger sister, because it has exactly the same number of spare wheels and spare gun trucks as the Henry Grace Adieu. Line pots are halved, but it actually has 2 more powder storage firkins than Henry Grace Adieu does. So once again, not a slouch in hand-to-hand combat, but perhaps definitely more configured for gunnery. And that brings us on to the Peter Pomegranate. This is a ship of 600 tons burthen, so only fractionally smaller than the Mary Rose, and only has 15 less crew, losing 15 mariners or sailors and keeping the same number of gunners and soldiers. And so you might expect a broadly similar ship to the Mary Rose, and you'd probably be right because, well, we've only lost 1 bronze gun. Although overall weight of fire has reduced quite a bit because we've lost 2 cannon, we've retained 2 demi-cannon, retained 2 culverin, lost 2 demi-culverin, but then gained 2 sakers and a falcon. So, as I said, only 1 less bronze gun, but generally a slightly lighter armament. But a significantly greater number of iron guns compared to the Mary Rose. A couple of extra port pieces thrown in there, your usual random grab bag of intermediate guns, but then more than twice as many bases as the Mary Rose. 66 compared to Mary Rose's 30, which is essentially the entirety of the increase, but also, interestingly enough, also 10 fewer handguns. Smaller guns, of course, means less powder needed, and indeed you only have just over 4 tons of powder, once again 2 tons of serpentine powder, but the corn powder has been reduced. Where you have similar guns on board, the allocation of shot per gun has also gone down slightly for iron shot, but proportional allocation in stone and lead shot for the more anti-personnel pieces has actually gone up quite dramatically. Offensive hand weapons have dropped very slightly, but defensive weapons, the pikes and the bills, have actually increased despite there only being the same number of soldiers aboard and slightly fewer crew. And there's a rather dramatic drop in tampions for the bigger guns, and an increase in the amount of paper for small guns and firearms, and spares and stores basically remain the same or slightly reduced, roughly in line with what you'd expect. So overall, this would lead me to conclude that the Peter Pomegranate is perhaps more set up like Henry Grace Adieu for some gunfire, but with a somewhat greater emphasis on boarding and close-range fighting as compared to the Mary Rose. And as you might have noticed, as the pictures swapped over, I think this is also supported by the depiction, as the Mary Rose, despite being the slightly larger ship by displacement, does appear to be slightly lower and leaner in the water than the Peter Pomegranate, which is a somewhat more heavily built-up ship in the style of an older galleon. Then we have the Matthew, She is exactly the same tons burthen as the Peter Pomegranate at 600, but carries only 3/4 of the crew. There's a directly proportional drop in soldiers and marines from 185 apiece to 138 apiece, but gunners drop from 30 to 24. And we've got quite a drop in bronze guns as well, so we've gone from 14 to 10 now, and in terms of specific types, we've lost both of the culverins, we've gained a demi-culverin, lost a Saker, and lost both of the falcons, so our long-range firepower now is somewhat diminished. Iron gun numbers are likewise down, although interestingly enough we still have exactly the same number of port pieces, and we actually have 2 slings as opposed to 2 demi-slings on the Peter Pomegranate. Same number of quarter slings. We've lost all 4 of the Fowlers, and we've lost a whole bunch of bases as well, although we retain the top pieces and 20 hail shot pieces. Another thing that's interesting is that we find the first occurrence of powder not measured in lasts in the Antony roll. We still have just over 2 tons of corn powder, just 1 ton of serpentine powder, so we've lost a whole ton of that, but we now have 40 pounds of fine corn powder. But rather interestingly, the proportions of shot per gun have gone up again, and we have a reoccurrence of crossbar shot for the first time since Henry VIII, although per gun stone and lead shot allocations are pretty much identical, with perhaps just a little bit more ammunition for the bases. Now, rather interestingly, despite the significantly lower numbers of crew, you have exactly the same number of longbows, slightly fewer bowstrings. There's actually a very unusually low proportion of bowstrings to bows across the Antony roll. The same number of arrows, a marked reduction in the number of pikes and bills, and a slight reduction in the number of darts, so potentially slightly proportionally more archers. Interestingly, though, despite everything else making it look like perhaps the Matthew is a slightly more gun-based version of the Peter Pomegranate, similar to how Mary Rose measures up to Henry VIII, there's a huge drop-off in the number of champions and canvas provided for cartridges, and a broadly similar reduction in spares and stores as compared to crew numbers, although, weirdly enough, there's 2,000 nails aboard, as opposed to 700 on the Peter Pomegranate. And that brings us on to ship number 5. Now, this video we're going to do 10 out of the 20 ships on the first part of the Antony roll, and you can let me know in the comments below if you want me to do the next 10 for the next Friday video. In any case, this is the Great Bark, and yes, for those of you who are wondering, there is also a small bark later on in the roll. It's a substantially smaller ship visually, but it's still rated at 500 tons burthen, and compared to the slightly larger Matthew, actually has the same number of crew at 300. Although, being very, very precise, you can see we've actually lost 2 soldiers, only 136 soldiers, but we've gained 2 gunners. So what does this mean for our overall firepower? Well, it actually means the Great Bark is punching well above its weight. Not only do we have 2 more bronze guns total, but we've increased our demi-cannon numbers by 3, up to a total of 5. We now have 2 culverins, they're back in again. Our demi-culverins have dropped from 5 to 3, and our Sakers have dropped from 3 to 2. So overall, the bronze guns, which as we said before are mostly the heavy anti-shipping guns, not only are there more of them, but they fire heavier ordnance on average, so the Great Bark is shaping up to be quite a nice gunship. In terms of iron guns, we're down by 19. Almost all of that is a reduction in the number of bases from 48 to 30. We have picked up a bunch of Fowlers and a couple of demi-slings, but we've also lost 4 of our port pieces, so overall, a slight rebalance, even in the iron guns, towards the heavier end of things. In Powderland, we've got another change. So we're no longer counting our serpentine powder in lasts stored in barrels. We instead now have 30 demi-barrels, or half barrels, of serpentine powder. We've still got our just over 2 tons of corn powder, and the fine corn powder is now 2 demi-barrels rather than 40 pounds. We've got fairly standard, kind of towards the higher end distribution of shot per gun for iron shot, but a rather dramatic reduction in the amount of stone and lead shot provided both in absolute terms and on a per-gun basis, with the exception of the bases, which, although they've got 100 rounds less in absolute terms, actually have a quite high number of rounds per gun because of that significant reduction in their overall numbers. We've got quite a significant fall in overall hand weapons, bows, bowstrings, arrows, pikes, bills, etc. The only thing that's staying the same here is darts in the fighting tops at 300. We've got a slight decrease in tampions, but a slight increase in the amount of canvas for cartridges. And unlike the Matthew, we're not acting as a fleet base for nails, apparently. But we do overall have slightly more spare parts for our guns. So that would suggest, all in all, that yes, in fact, the Great Bark is quite the little gunship. Now, thus far, we've been tracking ships that have been gradually decreasing in displacement. But now we come across the Jesus of Lubeck, which, for those of you who watched the channel for a while might know, was later destroyed during the reign of Henry VIII's daughter Elizabeth I at the Battle of San Juan de Ulua under the command of Drake and Hawkins when the Spanish ambushed them. But it appears here in the record, and as you can see, it's rated at 700 tons burthen, and the next few ships are also a little bit of a weird mishmash of displacements, or tons burthen at least. Now, you might be asking, well, why exactly is this? Well, it's not entirely clear. There are some suggestions that perhaps this is to do with its overall fighting capacity, i.e., despite its larger tonnage, the Jesus of Lubeck is a less capable combatant, therefore it's further down the list. But there is also the possibility that the first few ships that we've looked at were all built dedicated as warships, whereas, as you'll probably see from the next few, the Jesus of Lubeck and its subsequent ships seem to be, at least in large part, if not in whole, ships that Henry VIII had bought into service from other places. Now, to be fair, that doesn't necessarily also rule out combat not being necessarily their strong suit, as a number of ships, including the Jesus of Lubeck, are from the Hanseatic League, and were designed more as heavily armed merchantmen rather than dedicated warships the way that Henry Grâce à Dieu or Mary Rose would be. But in any case, since she is a 700-ton burthen vessel, we will be comparing her to the other 700-ton burthen vessel on this list, which is the Mary Rose. So compared to the Mary Rose, there's a roughly 25% drop in crew from 415 to 300, although the balance seen on Mary Rose with a slightly higher number of mariners as compared to soldiers is maintained, and although you do lose 6 gunners from 30 down to 24, compared to the overall drop in crew, it is a proportionally slightly smaller loss, because if you're doing it perfectly proportionally, you'd expect to have maybe 22 or 23 gunners, but it's still fairly close in overall proportional drops. But the bronze gun heavy anti-ship firepower? Yeah, that's dropped a lot. We have less than half as many bronze guns as on the Mary Rose. We have no demi-cannon. Cannon and culverin numbers are the same, though. We also have no demi-culverin, whereas the Mary Rose had 6. We've still got a pair of Sakers and nothing below that, whereas the Mary Rose had a Falcon. Iron guns don't drop quite as much, however, from 76 to 52. Now, while we do lose 8 port pieces, we gain in 8 slings, so overall no change in the number of guns for the top 2 entries, although obviously shot weight will go down. But we also have no demi-slings or quarter slings and 2 fewer Fowlers. Also, bases are down quite a bit, surprisingly. You have 30 on the Mary Rose and only 12 on the Jesus of Lubeck. Top pieces remain at 2, and hail shot pieces at 20. Powder also drops off quite a bit, although we're back up to lasts. We only have 2 tons of powder aboard, split evenly between serpentine and corn, plus 40 pounds of fine corn powder, whereas the Mary Rose, of course, had 5 tons aboard, 2 of serpentine and 3 of corn. Overall proportions of shot to guns seem to be roughly the same as on Mary Rose. At least in terms of iron shot, there's actually quite a high proportion of stone and lead shot, things like your top pieces and your port pieces. Yes, we've only got half as many port piece shot, but we have only a third as many port pieces, and there's twice as many shot for the top pieces. There is, however, quite a dramatic reduction in the number of hand weapons, about a third fewer pikes and bills, but also well over 50% reduction in bows and arrows. So not a lot of archers aboard the Jesus of Lubeck, and not a lot of guns either. And that can be seen in the overall munitions category. You've got less than a quarter as many tampions and half as much canvas for the cartridges, and overall dramatically less spares and stores. So essentially indicating that although the Jesus of Lubeck is displacing about as much as the purpose-built warship Mary Rose, she is a much less capable fighting vessel, thus illustrating that although she is still a fighting vessel, there is, even at this point in history, a difference in the equipment levels that you can put on a merchant ship that happens to have a lot of guns versus a warship. Then we move on to the Pauncy, which is the first of several of Henry VIII's ships whose name also needs translating. Now, there was a noble family called Pauncy at the time, but the general consensus seems to be that Pauncy is just one of many variations of a spelling for pansy, as in the flower, which isn't quite as unusual a name as you'd think when you get further down the line. And as you can see, she's a 450-tonner with a crew of 300, so we'll be comparing her to the Great Bark, which is only 50 tons more burthen and has exactly the same number of crew. Although, interestingly, the Pauncy has 2 fewer gunners, and they just added a couple more mariners in as a result. Despite the loss of those couple of gunners, the Pauncy actually has 1 more bronze gun than the Great Bark. It does have 1 fewer demi-cannon, 4 instead of 5, same number of culverins, same number of demi-culverins, but it has 4 sakers versus the Great Bark's 2. And we're also only down by 1 iron gun. We actually have 2 more port pieces, although we've sacrificed both of the Great Bark's slings. We've gained an extra couple of demi-slings. Both ships don't have any quarter slings. There's 3 more fowlers aboard the Pauncy, but 6 fewer bases, and we're also down to just a single top piece, which is actually the same on the Great Bark. But powder balance is slightly different. Both ships have 30 demi-barrels of serpentine powder, but whereas the Great Bark carries 2 barrels of corn powder and 2 demi-barrels of fine corn powder, the Pauncy carries 2 demi-barrels of corn powder and 40 pounds of fine corn powder, so slightly less corn and fine corn powder compared to the Great Bark. Overall shot allocation in terms of shot per gun, though, is almost identical to the Great Bark, at least when it comes to iron shot. And in lead and stone shot, it's actually also very similar, although there is 1 very marked reduction, which is half as much handgun shot. Now, although pikes, bills, and darts remain the same, there is actually quite a significant increase in the number of bows, 200 as opposed to 150 on the Great Bark, with a proportionate increase in bowstrings and arrows. For munition stores, the Pauncy carries 300 more tampions, but only 4 crowbars as opposed to 6. And in terms of spares and stores, the Pauncy actually carries slightly more spares, in that she has some more wheels, some more trucks, some more sheepskins, and otherwise almost everything else is very similar. She does also carry a couple more powder firkin storage bags. And so the Pauncy here seems to be taking along the Great Bark's theme of perhaps being quite a nimble gunship, although with a higher proportion of archers and a slightly lower proportion of other kinds of soldier. And now we have another ship of 500 tons, so again another one we're going to compare to the Great Bark. This is the Murrian or Murrian of Danzig, and again, a ship whose name needs translation, although this time it is a little bit unclear, because Murrian or Murrian is used alternately in various sources, and that term generally can translate to either fair sea or Moor, as in the Islamic inhabitants of Spain, although given the overall balance, I suggest that probably fair sea is the more likely of the two. And like the Jesus of Lubeck, she is, of course, as the name suggests, a ship that's been brought in from the Hanseatic League, although compared to the Great Bark, she does have, again, an identical number of crew, a very similar number of soldiers and mariners, but 6 fewer gunners. So let's see if that translates into firepower. So, bronze guns, well, it's really not good news. The Great Bark had 12, the Murrian only has 4, 2 culverins and 2 sakers, so no cannon, no demi-cannon, no demi-culverin. which means even that lower gun deck is likely to be a mix of bronze and iron guns. And in iron guns, it's also not brilliant news. Whereas the Great Bark had 71, the Murrian only has 27. 4 port pieces compared to 10, so combined with the bronze guns, that makes it likely that what you're looking at in that lower gun deck, where you've got 4 guns, is a culverin, a saker, and 2 port pieces. No slings, although 4 demi-slings, nothing else apart from bases, 12 of them compared to 30, a single top piece, and just 6 hail shot pieces compared to 20 on the Great Bark, and also only 12 handguns compared to 20. Now, in terms of powder, you might think, oh, hang on a minute, what's the thing doing with 8 tons of gunpowder on board? Well, now, helpfully, thanks to Tudor accountancy practices, we're into just barrels of gunpowder as opposed to lasts or tons of powder stored in barrels. So this is not 8 tons of serpentine powder, this is now just 8 barrels of serpentine powder, plus 1 demi-barrel of corn powder, and 24 pounds of fine corn powder. For reference, the Great Bark had 30 demi-barrels of serpentine powder, so about twice as much, roughly speaking, plus 2 full barrels of corn powder, and 2 demi-barrels of fine corn powder. Allocation of shot per gun is, obviously, overall there's fewer shot, but in terms of, as I said, shot per gun, you're looking at about average for the Tudor Navy, maybe a little bit lower than the Great Bark, but as we noted, the Great Bark is something of a gun vessel. And it's pretty much the same story with the stone and lead shot. Less overall, and slightly less per gun, but still within the realms of the general average parameters for a Tudor ship. Hand weapons, though, are a rather interesting factor. You have exactly the same number of bows as on the Great Bark, but quite a few more bowstrings, the same number of arrows, 50 more pikes, the same number of bills, and a dramatically lower number of darts. So although the Murrian is very definitely not a gun vessel, she is perhaps slightly better equipped to go into close-range melee with small arms and hand-to-hand. This is all made slightly bizarre by the fact she does carry 1,000 Tempions, which is considerably more than even the Great Bark does, although everything else that she carries is in slightly smaller supply when it comes to munition stores. And then in terms of general stores, there's nothing really that outstanding here, just a general slight reduction in almost everything. We now have the penultimate ship in this video, the Struse of Danzig, which is apparently the ostrich of Danzig. Nice and fancy. And since, as you can see, she only displaces 400 tons burthen, we shall be comparing her to the 450 tons burthen Pauncy. Now, immediately in comparison, she has 50 fewer crew at only 250, but interestingly enough, actually 4 more soldiers. Considerably fewer mariners, 44 less at only 96, and 10 fewer gunners, just 14. So are we about to see the miniature version of Henry VIII, a very boarding-oriented ship with probably not a huge amount of gunnery aboard? Well, initial signs point to yes. There's only 4 bronze guns compared to Pauncy's 13, and the heaviest we have is a pair of culverins plus a pair of sakers, whereas Pauncy was carrying 4 demi-cannon and 3 demi-culverin plus a couple more sakers. While the iron guns are also significantly reduced, the reduction isn't quite as severe. There's about half as many, with exactly half as many port pieces, so 6. So again, most likely what you're looking at that lower gun deck is potentially either a demi-culverin and 3 port pieces, or potentially a demi-culverin, a saker, and 2 port pieces with 2 other port pieces elsewhere. Neither ship carried any slings. Both ships carry 4 demi-slings. Neither ship has any quarter slings, but there are only 2 fowlers aboard the Struse, whereas the Pauncy carried 9, and there are only half as many bases at 12. Also 8 less hail shot pieces, just the 1 top piece on both sides, and only 12 handguns as opposed to 20. Unsurprisingly, there's a significant reduction in the amount of powder aboard. You only have 12 demi-barrels of serpentine versus 30, 1 demi-barrel of corn powder versus 2, and 24 pounds of fine corn powder versus 40. Shot levels at iron shot are broadly comparable. There's slightly more culverin shot, slightly less Saker shot, again on a per gun basis, but a dramatically greater amount of handgun shot per handgun, because there's actually twice as much handgun shot, even though there are fewer handguns. When it comes to non-powder based hand weapons, you have half as many bows, strings, and arrows, but an equal number of pikes and bills, and a very minimal number of darts. Unsurprisingly, the munition stores are considerably lower than you'd find on the Pauncy, with half as many tampions and most of everything else also reduced. And general spares are also significantly reduced. So although it has a relatively small number of bows comparative to everybody else, it does broadly seem to be that the Struse here is one of the much more close combat-oriented ships, as it has a relatively high ammunition allocation for small anti-personnel guns and a very small number of gunners and large anti-shipping guns, and again, proportionally a relatively high amount of bills and pikes. And our final ship for this week, at least, is the Mary of Hamburg. So she is, as you might guess, another ship that's been brought in from the Hanseatic League, and she also displaces 400 tons, but since she's a 400-tonner and a Hanseatic ship, let's compare her directly to the good old Struse. So the Mary carries 4 fewer crew, but a significant reduction in the number of soldiers from 140 to 119. Mariners have gone up from 96 to 111, and we've also picked up a couple more gunners. So are we going to see perhaps a slightly more gun-based, albeit still mercantile hull? Well, in terms of bronze guns, we do have one extra. We've picked up a Falcon. We still have 2 Sakers, but we only have 2 demi-culverin as opposed to the Struse, which had 2 full-scale culverin. So overall slightly less bronze gun broadside firepower, although 1 more gun. In terms of iron guns, the Mary, however, carries 2 fewer, for the same number of port pieces at 6, 2 demi-slings instead of 4 on the Struse, 2 Fowlers, 12 bases, 1 top piece, and 12 hail shot pieces. So essentially it's just those 2 demi-slings less. Everything else is literally the same numbers and the same type of guns. Powder, however, has gone up a bit. We have 1 demi-barrel of corn powder and 24 pounds of fine corn powder. That's the same, but we have 27 demi-barrels of serpentine powder as opposed to just 12 in the Struse. So given the guns themselves don't demand all that much more powder, probably more staying power. Moving on to the iron shot, the numbers are pretty much the same. 60 demi-culverin shot instead of 60 culverin shot, exactly the same number of Saker shot. Of course, you have the Falcon shot. That's actually relatively high for a single Falcon. A demi-sling shot, however, is somewhat reduced, and so is the dice for the hail shot. Stone and lead shot is essentially identical to the Struse, except for having 50 more rounds for the bases. But in hand weapons, we actually have 20 more bow staves, or staves, a considerably greater number of bow strings, and 10 more sheaves of arrows, so that's another 240 arrows. Same number of pikes and bills, same number of darts. Not a huge amount to write home about in terms of change in the munition stores. There's a couple of less pick hammers, a couple of less sledgehammers, same number of tampions. Interestingly, there's a paper quarter roll for cartridges, i.e. for handguns and so forth, whereas there wasn't any paper aboard the Struse, but broadly speaking, it's all very similar. And in terms of general spares and stores, it's pretty much identical to the Struse, except there's 30 foot less general timber. So my analysis would be that the Mary of Hamburg is broadly similar in capabilities to the Struse of Danzig, but is perhaps set up a bit better for a prolonged firefight. So there you have the larger ships of Henry VIII's Navy, at least as far as great ships are concerned. There is, of course, the second half of the great ship roll, and then the 2 other rolls, the galleasses and galleys, and then the really small stuff. For those of you who are interested, if this is popular enough, people want to see a second half, we can go on to look initially at the smaller half of the great ships, so the Christopher of Bremen, the Trinity Harry, the Small Bark, the Sweepstake, the Minion, another ship that's either the Thing or the Ironmonger, depending on your translation, the Mary Thomas, the Bark of Boulogne, also known as the Hoy Bark, rather interestingly, and then the really, really, really tiny stuff, the George and the Mary James, both of which are only 60 tons burthen. But hope you found this interesting so far, and let me know what you think in the comments below.